In the spring of 1946, a man walked out of a 4-story brownstone on 16th Street in Manhattan and did not look back. He had built everything inside that building. The shelves of hand-selected balsa, graded by weight and grain so precisely that modelers rode the subway from Brooklyn just to buy from him. The prototype gliders hanging from the ceiling on the second floor, each one a solved aerodynamic problem, each one something no one had managed to build before him. The yearbooks, stacked in the corner, filled with formulas and airfoil curves that the serious builders treated like scripture. He had built all of it. He had named it Jetco, Junior Aeronautical Supply Company. And for 13 years, it had been the most important address in American model aviation. He left it to his sister. He did not fight for it. He did not negotiate. He took the name, his name, the one he had earned, and he let Christine have the rest. Within months, the company he had built around the pure love of flight had a new name, a new direction, and a new designer hired to make it profitable. The gliders Frank Zayek had spent a decade perfecting were simplified. The tissue and balsa that he had treated like a craftsman's material were now product. The building on 16th Street was still there. The shelves were still stocked, but the man who had understood why any of it mattered was gone, 3,000 miles away, working as a draftsman for aerospace firms in California, republishing his yearbooks in his spare time for a readership that never stopped wanting them. He was 34 years old. What followed, the renamed company, the commercial kits, the move to Brooklyn, the slow fade from the hobby shop shelves, is a story about what happens when the soul of a thing departs before the body does. It is a story about an immigrant boy who taught himself the science of flight from library books, built an empire of balsa and tissue in a Manhattan brownstone, co-founded the Academy of Model Aeronautics, and then walked away from all of it. Not because he failed, but because he refused to become something he was not. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories behind the brands and the builders who shaped American hobby culture, the ones who built the dreams and the ones who watched them disappear. If that is the kind of history you want more of, give the video a like and subscribe. We cover the companies, the craftsmen, and the kits that a generation of American kids built on Saturday afternoons. The story begins in Slovenia in 1912. The village where Frank Zayek was born in 1912 was not a place that produced aeronautical engineers. Slovenia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a place that produced farmers, tradesmen, and soldiers. Frank built his first model airplane at age 4, not from a kit because no kits existed, but from scraps of wood and whatever he could find. And then World War I arrived and took everything, including the years a boy needs to become curious about the world. He was 10 years old when he and his brother John stepped off a boat in New York City in 1922. They had no money of significance, no English to speak of, and no connections in the city that would matter to the hobby that would define their lives. What they had was each other, and a hunger for the kind of technical problem that most people walk past without noticing. They began building model airplanes again in 1926, not as a hobby in the casual sense, as a pursuit. Frank read everything he could find about aerodynamic theory in the collections of the New York Public Library, teaching himself the mathematics of lift and drag the way a self-educated man learns anything, slowly, methodically, without a teacher to tell him when he was wrong. He had to figure out when he was wrong on his own, which meant he had to fly the models, study the failures, and go back to the books. By the time Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in May of 1927, and the entire country looked up at the sky and felt something shift, Frank Zayek already understood, in precise technical terms, what had made that flight possible. He was 15 years old. Lindbergh's crossing did something to a generation of American boys that is difficult to overstate. It did not merely inspire them, it reorganized their ambitions. Overnight, model aviation stopped being a fringe pursuit for eccentrics and became the logical extension of the most celebrated technological achievement in human history. Clubs formed in school basements, magazines launched, boys who had never thought about lift coefficients started arguing about them in drugstores. Frank Zayek was already years ahead of all of them, and he knew it, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had done the reading. By 1933, Frank was 21. The Depression had hollowed out large portions of the American economy, but it had done something unexpected for model aviation. It had made the hobby cheap enough to keep. A boy with 50 cents and a sheet of balsa could spend a weekend building something that flew. Frank saw that clearly. He also saw something else, something that the growing community of model builders needed and did not have. There was almost no reliable technical literature, no organized source of quality materials, no single address where a serious builder could go and trust what he was getting. He opened Jetco on East 6th Street in Lower Manhattan in 1933, and from the beginning it was not quite a store, and not quite a publishing house, and not quite a research operation. It was all three, organized around a single conviction: that model aviation deserved to be taken seriously as a technical discipline, and that the people who practiced it deserved better than guesswork. The first address was a modest space, but Frank's approach was not modest. He sourced balsa with the precision of a material scientist, selecting wood by density and grain, grading it in ways that the hobby supply market had never bothered to do. Modelers who bought from Jetco reported a consistency they had never encountered elsewhere. The balsa was not merely lighter or straighter than what they could find at the Five and Dime. It behaved predictably. For a builder trying to hold a wing to within fractions of an ounce, that was the difference between a model that flew and one that did not. The yearbooks came next. Frank began publishing his Model Aeronautics Yearbook in 1935. Dense, technical volumes filled with design theory, airfoil data, contest records, and construction methods. They were not written for beginners. They were written for the builder who wanted to understand why a design worked, not merely how to copy it. The first volume was distributed at the 1936 National Model Airplane Championships in Detroit. Serious builders passed copies between each other the way engineers share technical papers. Frank Zayek had not merely entered the hobby supply market. He had positioned himself as its intellectual center. By the mid-1930s, the operation had outgrown East 6th Street. Jetco moved to a 4-story brownstone at 16th Street near 3rd Avenue, and the building became something between a cathedral and a workshop for the American model aviation community. The second floor held the retail office and Frank's prototypes, gliders hanging from the ceiling, each one representing months of aerodynamic calculation. The upper floors stored lumber, balsa selected by hand, cut to specification, managed by John Zayek and a man named Thurston, who knew the material almost as well as Frank did. 2 blocks north, a rented storefront handled kit packing and shipping. The thermic gliders began to emerge from those upper floors in the late 1930s. Tow-line sailplanes, with wingspans ranging from 18 inches to over 70, built from balsa and tissue, covering the ribs and formers with a material so thin it caught the light like a paper lantern. The thermic designs were not simplified for mass appeal. They were built around Frank's understanding of slow-speed aerodynamics, undercambered airfoils, V-tail configurations, proportions arrived at through calculation rather than intuition. They flew. Contest builders trusted them. The thermic name became, in the circles that understood such things, a mark of genuine aeronautical credibility. In 1935, Frank helped organize the committee that would become the Academy of Model Aeronautics. He was 23 years old, an immigrant with a library card and a balsa knife, and he was sitting in rooms with the people who were formalizing what would become the governing body of American model aviation. The first publication of what would become AMA's Model Aviation magazine was a booklet Frank produced himself, distributed at the 1936 Nationals in Detroit. By 1939, Jetco was the most respected name in American model aviation supply. Not the largest, not the most commercial, the most respected. Then the war came and took the brothers. Frank and John both served in World War II. The exact details of their service are not fully documented in available records, but what is known is this: when they came home, the world they returned to was not the one they had left. The hobby was changing. The market was changing. The boys who had grown up building thermic gliders in the late 1930s were now men with jobs and families, and a new generation of younger builders wanted something different. Simpler kits, powered models, designs they could finish in a weekend rather than a month. The slow technical meditative discipline that Frank Zayek had built Jetco to serve was still alive, but it was no longer the center of gravity it had been. Frank saw this clearly. The question was what to do about it. The answer Frank Zayek gave to that question was the same answer he had always given to every problem the hobby presented. Go deeper, not wider. The post-war market was pulling towards simplicity. Cheaper kits, faster builds, powered models with glow-plug engines that a 12-year-old could assemble in a single afternoon. Frank understood the commercial logic. He simply did not care about it. What he cared about was the thermic line. The gliders he had spent a decade refining, the sailplanes that required patience and precision and rewarded the builder with something no powered kit could replicate. A model that climbed on invisible columns of rising air, riding the same thermals that full-scale sailplane pilots chased on weekend afternoons over the fields of upstate New York. The post-war thermic designs pushed further than anything Frank had built before the war. The Thermic 50, with its 50-inch wingspan, was a contest-grade tow-line glider that required a builder to understand what they were doing. The tissue covering had to be applied with care, dampened, stretched, doped, to achieve the taut, drum-tight surface that gave the wing its aerodynamic efficiency. The ribs were cut to Frank's airfoil templates, each one shaped to carry the undercambered profile he had derived from the slow-speed aerodynamic research he had been accumulating since the early 1930s. A well-built Thermic 50, flown on a calm morning with a proper high start, could stay aloft for durations that surprised people who had never seen one fly. The building on 16th Street in the late 1940s was, by the accounts of those who worked and shopped there, unlike any retail space in American hobby culture. The prototypes hung from the ceiling of the second floor, the way museum pieces hang in a gallery, each one a solved problem, each one something Frank had built and tested and refined before it became a kit. A teenager who walked up those stairs to buy Balsa was walking into the working mind of a man who took model aviation as seriously as the engineers at the aerospace firms took full-scale aircraft. Richard Smith, who worked at Jetco part-time in the early 1950s and knew the Zayaks well, recalled years later that the Balsa on those upper floors was managed with a precision that was unusual even by the standards of the most serious supply houses. Thurston and John Zayak cut the lumber there. Frank selected it. The yearbooks continued through the post-war years, and they remained what they had always been. The most technically rigorous publications in American model aviation. Frank published airfoil data, contest records, construction analyses, and aerodynamic theory in volumes that serious builders kept on shelves alongside their engineering texts. The 1941 edition had been the last before the war interrupted production. When Frank resumed publishing in the late 1940s, the readership picked up exactly where it had left off. There was no other publication like them in American aeromodeling, and there would not be one after Frank stopped producing them. The community that gathered around Jetco in those years was not a mass market. It was something rarer and more durable, a community of people who cared about getting it right. Contest flyers came to Jetco for materials because they trusted the grade of Balsa Frank stocked. Designers came because Frank's yearbooks gave them data they could not find anywhere else. Young builders came because the building on 16th Street was the kind of place that took them seriously. A 10-year-old with 50 cents and a genuine question about airfoil selection would get an answer from Frank Zayak that he could use. This was the Jetco that mattered, not as a commercial enterprise, it never particularly prospered, but as an institution. Frank Zayak had built something that served the hobby the way a university serves a discipline, not by making things easy, but by making things possible. The kits that Jetco produced in this period sold in hobby shops across the Northeast, and, through mail order, across the country. The thermic designs were carried by shops that understood what they were selling, specialty retailers that stocked Jetco alongside Berkeley and Comet and Sterling, the premium section of the hobby shop where the serious builders shopped. A built Thermic 72 with its 72-inch wingspan was not something a casual modeler finished without effort. It was also not something a casual modeler forgot after it was done. Then, sometime in the late 1940s, Frank Zayak looked at what the post-war market wanted and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was not going to give it to them. The pressure was specific and documented. The arrival of small, reliable glow-plug engines, the K and B Torpedo, 020 among them, had transformed what the hobby market expected. Towline gliders, however beautiful, however technically refined, required a field, a high start or a towline, and a builder willing to invest weeks in construction. Powered free-flight models required less of all of those things, and delivered the immediate satisfaction that the post-war consumer market had decided it wanted. Christine, who had been running the business operations alongside Frank and John through the late 1940s, understood this. She wanted Jetco to respond to it. She wanted the thermic line simplified. She wanted powered kits. She wanted a broader catalog aimed at a larger and less technical audience. Frank's position was not complicated. He had not built Jetco to sell simplified kits to people who did not want to learn what they were doing. He had built it to serve the builder who wanted to understand. The moment Jetco became something else, the moment it optimized for accessibility over precision, for margin over craft, it was no longer the thing he had made. He could see, with the same clarity that had always characterized his thinking, exactly where that road led. He had watched other supply houses go down it. He did not intend to follow. What happened next within the Zayek family is not fully documented. The exact conversations, the specific disagreements, the precise moment the decision was made, none of that appears in the available record. What is known is the outcome. Frank Zayek, who had founded Jetco in 1933 at the age of 21, who had co-founded the Academy of Model Aeronautics, who had spent 15 years building the most technically credible address in American model aviation, retained the Jetco name for himself and left the business to Christine and John. The company was renamed Jetco. Frank Zayek drove west. He would not return to the model kit business in any meaningful commercial capacity. He was in his mid-30s. He had a continent between him and the building on 16th Street, and the organization he had left behind, the one now carrying a name he had not chosen, was about to become something he had spent 15 years trying not to build. Christine Zayek inherited a company with a name, a catalog, a loyal customer base, and a problem she understood clearly. None of it was making enough money. The thermic line was beloved. It was also slow, expensive to produce relative to its retail price, and aimed at a shrinking segment of the hobby market. The contest builders who bought thermic gliders were serious, dedicated, and relatively few. The massive post-war American boys who were flooding into hobby shops every weekend were looking for something they could build faster, something with an engine, something that did not require them to understand undercambered airfoils before they could take it to the park. Christine was not wrong about any of this. The market data, such as it was in 1946, pointed in one direction. The independent hobby shops that carried Jetco's line were telling her the same thing their shelves were already showing. The glider section was moving slowly. The powered model section could not be stocked fast enough. What she needed was a designer, someone who understood production, understood the commercial kit market, and could take the Jetco name into the territory where the volume was. She found him in New Jersey. Frank Ayling was not an unknown quantity in American aeromodeling. He had been publishing designs in Air Trails magazine through the late 1940s, sometimes under his own name and sometimes under pseudonyms, and the builds had drawn attention for their cleanness of line and their reliability in the air. He understood the difference between a design that was aerodynamically elegant and a design that a 12-year-old could build without breaking 4 ribs before the wing was sheeted. Those are not the same skill, and Ayling had both. Christine hired him as full-time designer and manager of the kit packaging operation. It was, by any commercial measure, the right decision. Ayling arrived at Jetco and immediately began restructuring what the company produced and how it produced it. The result was the Phoenix series, a line of powered free flight and control line kits that was cleaner, more accessible, and more competitive on hobby shop shelves than anything Jetco had previously offered. He also worked through the thermic line, re-engineering the construction sequences and simplifying certain elements to make the kits more buildable for the broader audience Christine was targeting. The models flew. The kits sold better than the old thermic line had sold. By the early 1950s, Jetco had a working product line, a functioning designer, and a place in the hobby shop ecosystem that Jetco, for all its intellectual prestige, had never quite achieved commercially. But something had changed in the building on 16th Street that could not be measured in units shipped. The prototype gliders that Frank Zayek had hung from the ceiling of the second floor, the ones that represented years of aerodynamic calculation, the ones that had told every serious builder who walked up those stairs exactly what kind of company they were dealing with, were still there. The shelves of carefully graded balsa were still stocked. The physical address was the same, but the organizing principle had shifted. Jetco had been built around the question, what does the craft require? Jetco was answering a different question, what does the market want? Those two questions are not always in conflict. In the early 1950s, under Ailing's hand, Jetco managed to hold them in reasonable tension. The Phoenix series was commercially competent without being artistically dishonest. Ailing was a real designer, not a copyist, and his work showed it. The tension, however, was always there, and it was located specifically in the relationship between Frank Ailing and Christine Zayek. The details of their disagreements are not fully documented, but the pattern is clear from what community sources recorded in the years that followed. Ailing was a designer first. Christine was a businesswoman first. A designer who has built something he believes in does not easily accept being told to simplify it further, to cut a material, to reduce a part count, to make a kit that sells at a lower price point, even if what it produces in the air is correspondingly reduced. These conversations happen in every company that tries to hold craft and commerce in the same room. At Jetco, they did not resolve well. Frank Ailing left Jetco. He went to Washington, D.C. to work for the Academy of Model Aeronautics, the organization that Frank Zayek had helped found 2 decades earlier. It was not a coincidence of direction. It was the logical destination for a designer who had spent years trying to do serious work inside a structure that had stopped prioritizing serious work. His departure left Jetco without the one thing that had given the post-war company its commercial credibility. A designer of genuine ability who could be trusted to produce kits that were both buildable and worth building. Christine responded the way a businesswoman running a kit company without a staff designer responds. She licensed designs from prominent modelers in the community. Jetco began kitting outstanding designs from various well-known contest builders, an approach that produced a brief spell of relative success in the mid to late 1950s. The catalog was not without merit. Individual designs were well regarded. The Nordic, the Hawk, the Sabre Stunt control liner, these were kits that modelers of the period remembered with genuine affection, not nostalgia's distortion, but the specific recall of something that had actually performed. But Jetco was no longer building anything. It was assembling, licensing, packaging. The creative engine that had made the 16th Street address meaningful, first Frank Zayek's aerodynamic theory, then Frank Ailing's design ability, was gone. What remained was a brand name, a supplier network, and a woman running a shrinking operation in a market that was moving toward plastic injection molding with a speed that no balsa kit company was equipped to match. John Zayek, who had stayed on through the transition, left sometime in the late 1950s. He went on to design and sell a modest line of single-channel radio control models under his own name, a quiet, independent operation that suited him. His departure removed the last member of the founding family from the daily operations of the company Frank had built. The hobby shop shelves told the larger story without editorial comment. Through the early 1960s, the plastic injection molded kit had completed its conquest of the American hobby market: Revel, Monogram, Aurora, AMT. These were the names filling the racks now: brightly lithographed boxes with painted box art, injection molded parts trees, kits a boy could build in an afternoon and have something that looked finished. Against that, the balsa and tissue kit, however beautifully designed, however satisfying to build properly, looked like a different hobby entirely, because it was. Jetco moved to Brooklyn. The new address was on Lexington Avenue in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, a long way in every sense from the brownstone on 16th Street where Frank Zayek had hung his glider prototypes from the ceiling and sold carefully graded balsa to builders who rode the subway from all over the city to buy from him. The company continued to produce kits at the Brooklyn address, operating under the name C.A. Zayek Company, Christine's name now, plainly on the door. The catalog narrowed, the orders thinned. The hobby shops that had carried Jetco through the 1950s were themselves under pressure. The mass retail chains that were beginning to dominate American consumer spending had no patience for specialty balsa kits aimed at builders who wanted to learn aerodynamics. They wanted plastic. They wanted Aurora monster kits and Revell car models and AMT snap-together aircraft. The independent hobby shop, which had been Jetco's primary retail channel since 1933, was entering a decade-long decline that would eventually remove most of them from the American commercial landscape entirely. By the late 1960s, by most community accounts, production at the Brooklyn address had wound down. There was no announcement, no final catalog, no press release. The orders simply stopped coming in sufficient numbers to justify continuing, and the company that had begun as Frank Zayek's supply house for serious model builders in Depression-era Manhattan faded from the hobby shop shelves the way most small American specialty manufacturers faded, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the gradual silence of a phone that rang less and less frequently until one day it did not ring at all. The building on 16th Street in Manhattan was still standing. Frank Zayek's prototype thermic gliders were long gone from its ceiling. There was no final day at Jetco that anyone recorded. No shift foreman walked the floor at closing time and told the workers it was over. No trade publication ran a notice. No hobby magazine marked the occasion with an obituary or a retrospective. The company in Brooklyn simply reached the point where the gap between what it cost to operate and what the market was willing to pay for balsa and tissue kits could no longer be bridged, and it stopped. This is how most small American manufacturers end. Not in a single declared moment, but in the accumulation of small silences. The order that does not come, the reorder that is not placed, the supplier invoice that goes unpaid, not from negligence, but from arithmetic. The hobby shop owner in Ohio, who had stocked Jetco kits since 1954, did not receive a letter explaining that the line was being discontinued. He simply noticed, sometime in the late 1960s, that his last reorder had not been fulfilled, and that when he called the number in Brooklyn, the conversation was not encouraging. He moved the remaining boxes to the clearance shelf. When those sold, he did not reorder. That is the final day of Jetco, replicated across several hundred hobby shops in a dozen states over the better part of a decade. Not a single closing, but a slow recession, like a tide going out so gradually that no one marks the exact moment the beach is empty. What made this ending different from the ending of Aurora, or AMT, or Monogram? The companies whose closings came with documented dates and auction notices, and the specific drama of injection molds going to warehouses or foreign buyers, was that Jetco's death had already happened. Not in Brooklyn in the late 1960s. On 16th Street in Manhattan, sometime in the late 1940s, when Frank Zayek picked up whatever he was carrying and walked down those stairs for the last time. The company survived that departure by roughly 20 years. The name survived it. The catalog survived it. Transformed and redirected and commercially repositioned by Christine and Ailing and the licensed designers who followed. Some of the kits that came out of the Jetco years were genuinely good. The Thermic 100, designed by Don McGovern in the later period, was regarded by free flight builders as one of the finest tow-line glider kits the company ever produced. More pieces than most builders expected, more demanding to construct, and better in the air for both of those things. The Hawk rubber-powered model flew cleanly. The Sabre Stunt gave control line flyers a capable ship at a fair price. Jetco was not without merit in the years after Frank left. But the thing that had made the address on 16th Street worth crossing the city for, the organizing intelligence behind the material selection, the design theory, the yearbooks, the hanging prototypes, that was gone the morning Frank Zayek got in his car and drove toward California. He did not disappear. That is important to understand. Frank Zayek did not retreat into bitterness or silence. He went to work for aerospace firms in the San Fernando Valley, the same valley where the post-war American aviation industry was building the machines that would eventually carry men to the moon, and he did his drafting work, and in his spare time, he kept writing. The yearbooks continued, not as Jasco publications, not as Jetco publications, but as Frank Zayek publications, his name on the cover, his aerodynamic research inside, printed and distributed to the community of serious builders who had never stopped wanting them. A 1995 Los Angeles Times article found him at 70, still building model airplanes in North Hills, California, still flying, still thinking about slow-speed aerodynamics with the same focus he had brought to the New York Public Library in the late 1920s as a teenage immigrant trying to understand why wings worked. He had outlasted Jasco. He had outlasted Jetco. He had outlasted most of the American hobby industry that had grown up around the discipline he helped define. And he was still at the workbench. His brother John died in 2001. John left Frank a sum of money with a specific instruction: use it to honor others who had contributed to aeromodeling. Frank worked with the AAMA to establish what became the John Zayek Memorial Award. And after Frank's own death in May of 2005, at the age of 93, it was renamed the Frank and John Zayek Memorial Award. It continues to be presented today, 93 years old. He had outlived Christine. He had outlived Jetco. He had outlived the independent hobby shop, the balsa and tissue era, the towline glider contest circuit, and most of the modelers who had ridden the subway to 16th Street to buy hand-graded balsa from a man who took the grain of the wood as seriously as an aeronautical engineer takes the grain of an aluminum spar. He reprinted the yearbooks in his final decades, the same volumes he had first distributed at the 1936 Nationals in Detroit, now sought by collectors and historians who understood what they contained. They sold steadily. They still do. The plans for the thermic designs, the airfoil templates, the rib layouts, the construction sequences that Frank had worked out through years of flight testing, did not vanish with the company. The free flight community does not discard things that work. Reproduction kits built from Frank's original plans have been produced by small specialty publishers in the decades since Jetco ceased production. A modeler today can still build a Thermic 72 from plans that trace directly back to the calculations Frank Zayick made in a Manhattan brownstone in the 1940s. The tissue will be the same weight. The balsa, if chosen carefully, will behave the same way. The airfoil will lift in the same thermal that lifted the original. The building on 16th Street near 3rd Avenue in Manhattan still stands. The company that occupied it for more than a decade, the one with the prototypes hanging from the second-floor ceiling and the hand-graded balsa on the upper floors, has been gone for more than half a century. The plans survived. The name did not carry the weight of the man who made it to matter. The last kit left the Brooklyn address without ceremony. No press release, no final shift. No one to turn off the lights who remembered what the lights had illuminated. The building at 16th Street near 3rd Avenue in Manhattan still stands today, as it has stood through every decade since Frank Zayick hung his first thermic prototype from its second-floor ceiling. It does not carry a plaque. There is nothing on its exterior to indicate that the most technically serious address in American model aviation once operated inside it. The city has moved on around it the way cities move on around everything, indifferently, completely, without acknowledgement. The Brooklyn address where Jetco spent its final years is similarly unmarked. The Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood that surrounded the CA. Zayick Company on Lexington Avenue has been through several transformations since the late 1960s, none of them connected to balsa gliders or towline sailplanes. The last tenant of the hobby supply trade left no visible trace. The Jasco and Jetco brand names are not currently in commercial production. No corporation holds the IP and manufactures kits under the name. There was no acquisition, no leveraged buyout, no foreign buyer for the tooling, because the tooling for a balsa kit company is not injection molds worth transporting across an ocean. It is die-cut patterns and construction plans, and those are not the kind of assets that attract the attention of corporate acquirers. Jasco and Jetco simply ended, and what they had built dispersed into the community that had always cared most about it. That community kept the designs alive in the way that serious hobby communities keep things alive, through obsessive preservation, careful reproduction, and the refusal to accept that something worth building should become unbuildable. The free flight community, organized through clubs affiliated with the Academy of Model Aeronautics and through specialty publications that have served contest builders for decades, maintained the thermic plans in circulation long after the company that produced them ceased to exist. PR Models and other small specialty publishers have offered reproduction kits built from Frank's original plans. A modeler today who wants to build a Thermic 72 can find the plans. The airfoil is the same. The construction sequence is the same. The result, built with care, will fly the same thermals that the original flew over the fields of New York and New Jersey in the 1940s. On the collector market, original unbuilt Jasco and Jetco kits in good condition command prices that reflect their scarcity more than their original retail value. A Thermic 100 Imperial in its original box, the one with the V-tail configuration and the construction complexity that surprised even experienced builders, has appeared at free flight meets and on specialty auction sites in the range of several $100s for an intact example. Original Frank Zayick yearbooks in collectible condition are similarly sought, particularly the early volumes from the 1930s and 1940s. The reprints Frank produced in his California years are more available and more affordable, and they contain the same technical content, which was always the point. The surprise footnote in Frank Zayek's story is not hidden. It is simply underreported. One account, a single published source, and it should be read with that qualification clearly in mind, credits Frank Zayek with contributing to the early design work of Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, which opened in 1967. If accurate, the detail reframes his California years in a way that is almost too perfectly ironic. The man who built America's most technically serious model aviation company, who left it rather than compromise its intellectual standards, ended up helping Walt Disney build the ride that would eventually spawn one of the most commercially successful film franchises in history. The man who refused commercialization, contributing to the most commercial entertainment enterprise on Earth. No corroborating Disney Imagineering documentation has been located to confirm this connection, and it remains in the category of community lore rather than verified history. But it has the texture of something true, the kind of detail that attaches itself to a life like Frank Zayek's, because his life was the kind that attracted such adjacencies. What the Jasco and Jetco story represents, set against the broader arc of American hobby culture in the 20th century, is something more specific than the standard collapse narrative. This is not the story of a company destroyed by a conglomerate acquirer, or undercut by cheaper foreign imports, or failed by management that did not understand the market. This is the story of a man who understood the market completely, saw exactly where it was going, and chose not to follow it, and was right about the choice even as it cost him the company he had built. Frank Zayek's conviction was simple, and, in its way, radical, that the people who practiced model aviation as a serious discipline deserved to be served by someone who took it as seriously as they did. That grading balsa by density and grain was not excessive. That publishing aerodynamic theory for an audience that wanted to understand why their models flew was not self-indulgent. That building a thermic glider from tissue and balsa over the course of several weeks, and then taking it to a field and reading the air until the thermal came, and watching it climb until it was a dot against a blue sky, that this was not a lesser experience because it was more demanding than snapping together a plastic kit on a Saturday afternoon. He was not wrong. The people who built his gliders knew he was not wrong. The community that preserved his plans across 6 decades of hobby market transformation knew he was not wrong. The collectors who pay several $100s for an unbuilt thermic in its original box know he was not wrong. He simply lived in a market that could not afford to agree with him. Somewhere tonight, in a basement in Ohio, or a garage in New Mexico, or a spare bedroom in the suburbs of Long Island, someone is unfolding a set of Frank Zayek's plans, the real ones, or a reproduction so faithful to the original that the difference does not matter, and cutting ribs from a sheet of balsa they selected for weight and grain the way Frank taught, and covering the framework with tissue so thin it catches the light like a paper lantern, building something that will climb on air that no engine touches, the way a man from Slovenia, who could not afford an education, taught a generation of American boys to build the sky. See you in the next one.